Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am seeing a couple more people joining, but I think I will go ahead and start with my introductory remarks for the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council today, and that way we can give today's speaker, Mr. Hassan Al-Tayab, plenty of time for his comments, which I know is the real reason you are here. So welcome. Today is Tuesday, March 16th, and we're excited to host another Iowa City Foreign Relations Council program with Mr. Hassan Al-Tayab, who will speak today on returning to diplomacy with Iran. My name is Thais Winkelblack. I'm an Iowa City Foreign Relations Council board member and today's program host. As always, we thank our members, supporters, and interns for making these forums possible. I want to acknowledge our organizational supporters, the University of Iowa's international programs, the University of Iowa's honors program, the University of Iowa Public Policy Center, and the Stanley UI Foundation Support Organization. They all contribute some financial support to our organization, and for that we are grateful. I also want to thank City Channel 4 and the UI Digital Libraries for helping us continue to make our programs available to online audiences. And we would also like to mention our gratitude to the Iowa Arts Council for their financial support through the Iowa Arts and Culture Recovery Program. The ICFRC, like so many others, have been hanging on during a pandemic, and we have pivoted, and we are appreciative of support like that through the Iowa Arts Council for helping us. As we get started, even though many of you are old hat at Zoom by now, I want to cover a couple of Zoom etiquette tips. First of all, while I'm speaking, you might just refamiliarize yourself with your screen because every computer is a little bit different. And so if you can make sure you know where your mute and unmute and your stop video and start video buttons are, we would like to ask all of you, and many of you know this, and I see you're already complying, to stay muted and to keep your video feed turned off during the speaker's remarks, just so it's easier for all of us to focus on our speaker. And then at the end of the program, there'll be a 15-minute Q&A. And at that time, we'd really invite all of you to stay muted, but to go ahead and turn on your video feed so that our speaker has a little bit more interactivity with our members during the Q&A session. So looking forward to that portion. That's always my favorite part. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you today Mr. Hassan Al-Tayab. Hassan Al-Tayab is the Friends Committee on National Legislation lead lobbyist on Middle East policy. He is also responsible for representing FCNL with the various coalitions that work on these issues. Prior to joining FCNL in August of 2019, he was co-director of the national advocacy group Just Foreign Policy, where he led their lobbying work to advance a more progressive foreign policy in the Middle East and in Latin America. He played a major role in the successful passage of the War Powers Resolution to end U.S. military aid to the Saudi UAE coalition's war on Yemen. Hassan's passion for foreign affairs is rooted in his desire to make life better for people in the Middle East, including his extended family in Jordan. His writings and commentaries have been featured in numerous news outlets, including BBC World News, The Hill, Al Jazeera, The Huffington Post, The Intercept, and more. Today, Hassan will be speaking on the state of U.S. relations with Iran as they relate to foreign policy changes with the new administration. Please join me in a warm welcome to Mr. Hassan Al-Tayab. Hassan, I'm going to turn this over to you for your presentation.
Well, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I've spent a little time in Iowa. I was a full-time musician before being lobbyist and having to wear a tie on Capitol Hill, and I played some bar in Ames, and I really enjoyed it. But anyway, you didn't come here to talk about music. Maybe later, some other time. But right now, let's talk about the Iran deal and what we can do to support diplomacy and restoring this really important nuclear accord. So, first off, what was the JCPOA and what did it do? The Iran nuclear deal, otherwise known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action or the JCPOA, it was signed in 2015 by Iran and several world powers, including the United States. And the JCPOA was important because it put significant restrictions on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. The agreement required Iran to alter its heavy water reactor so it didn't provide a so it did not provide a pathway to weapons grade plutonium, the material for the most powerful atomic weapons. And Iran had done so. It also set limits on Iran's nuclear stockpile or stockpiles of enriched uranium, as well as centrifuges that produce it. And it gave the IAEA, or the International Atomic Energy Agency, access to nuclear sites and video monitoring. The nuclear inspectors were confident that they had what they needed to detect any nuclear activity. And furthermore, the deal gave the IAEA 25 years of inspection rights. So, what happened? Trump began this maximum pressure campaign after pulling out of the deal in 2018. So, despite Iran being in full compliance of the terms of the accord, the United States, under the Trump administration, withdrew in 2018 and began a maximum pressure campaign on Iran. And this unfortunately increased tensions all throughout the Middle East. It emboldened anti-American hardliners and made life increasingly difficult for ordinary civilians in Iran who were, struggling to get access to critical life-saving medicines. There was also the escalation of the January 2020 assassination of Qasem Soleimani, which only deteriorated the situation further. And our countries have moved disturbingly close to war, throughout that time. Like I said before, ordinary Iranians have really suffered dramatically under the crushing weight of American sanctions, particularly with the COVID-19 virus taking a really heavy toll on the country. And their inability to get life saving medicines, PPE, testing kits, respirators, sanitizer, and now even the vaccine. In response to the reimposition of these sanctions, Iran enriched nuclear materials at levels exceeding the JCPOA caps, and they shortened their breakout time to obtain a functional nuclear weapon. Now, they were over a year out from breakout, and now they're just a few months away. So the Biden administration has promised a new approach. They want to revive nuclear talks and actually campaigned on restoring to the Iran nuclear deal. We've seen Secretary Blinken, Robert Malley, Wendy Sherman, and others in the administration all echo their support for a compliance for compliance return to the Iran deal in nomination hearings. We've also seen House Democrats be pretty outspoken about this. Last December, in 2020, 150 House members sent a letter to President-elect Biden in support of that approach as well. And preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon has and remains a really critical priority with broad international support because should Iran develop nukes, that could trigger a dangerous situation in the Middle East where other countries would want to also obtain nuclear weapons, like Egypt or Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and they've all been pretty clear about their desire to have nuclear weapons, and a nuclear armed Iran would only increase that desire. So Iran says that since the U.S. first left the deal, that we must do what's right to take the first step and patch things up, and they really want Biden and his administration to lift sanctions on Iran, and then they'll return to compliance. The Biden administration is saying, well, Iran should come into compliance and then we'll lift sanctions. So we're sort of at an impasse here, where I hope we can come to some sort of diplomatic accord and have a mediated process that addresses this. But hardliners in the U.S. are insisting that Biden should demand broad new concessions from the Iranian government unrelated to the nuclear program, including addressing Iran's ballistic missile program and its support for regional proxies as a condition for lifting the economic sanctions that the Trump administration reimposed. I just want to flag that on the Hill right now, there's some letters circulating around that have been pretty unhelpful for this. There's one that's been circulated by Senators Graham and Menendez, which call for this approach, and another one by Reps Brown and Reps Waltz. And they both kind of reject the reject the Biden administration's compliance for compliance call and make it a little bit harder and close the political space. And I'll say that they're also bipartisan. So we do have some issues there. So one, I think I want to just address some of the points that folks are making in that camp. For starters, it's just really unrealistic. And it's mostly pushed by people that are okay with the Iran nuclear deal failing, which I'm not okay with. And tying every single issue we have with Iran to an arms control deal would be historically unparalleled. There's no precedent for an arms control agreement that simultaneously solves every dispute between the parties. On the matter of ballistic missiles, Iran is not the only country in the Middle East that has a ballistic missile program. Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the UAE, they do as well. And I just add that, the Biden administration is considering a $23 billion weapons deal with the UAE right now that, would give them F-35s, they'll give them Reaper drones and munitions and ballistics. So the idea that the Iranians would give up granted, they're still sorting out whether or not, they're going to approve that sale. They're going to figure that out by April, mostly because of the war in Yemen, and they're trying to figure out what counts as offensive and what counts as defensive. And if they, so they're still sorting that out. But the idea that the Iranians would give up their missiles, but no one else would have to, is pretty unrealistic and something that I just don't see working. It's also really unlikely that the U.S. could get an agreement from all the other permanent members of the United Nations Security Council plus Germany on these limitations. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had insisted that Iran remove all its forces from Syria who support Assad. The problem is that Russia, another party to the deal, also backs Assad, and it'd be really unlikely for Putin to sign off on that demand. So the United States, based on how we, approach the deal under the Trump administration, really is not in the best place to be making demands right now because of Trump's withdrawal from the agreement. And Iran had been honoring the agreement in exchange for sanctions relief even a year after the U.S. left the deal. And as I mentioned before, under the JCPOA, Iran had sharply reduced its stockpile of enriched uranium and had given the IAEA widespread access to its nuclear facilities. And this is not to say that the broader concerns about Iran should be ignored, but rather it's about sequencing. And what FCNL is working on is getting that sequencing right. We have to first restore the Iran deal, the 2015 deal, and then work for follow-on negotiations to address these other areas of concern. And now, I think the most plausible way forward would be for both sides to move back in unison back into compliance. And it's possible that the Europeans could potentially mediate the step-by-step compliance for compliance return. And Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, he's suggested this idea as well. Robert Malley in the Biden administration has indicated his support for this too. So the Biden team has really tried to ease the way forward by announcing an official reversal of Trump's declaration that the United Nations snapback sanctions had been reimposed on Iran. He also agreed to multi-party talks about restoring the deal. Unfortunately, they were rejected by Iran because of this sanctions program. And the administration has also made it a little bit easier for Iranian diplomats to travel. So he's lifted some of those constraints, but still, we're not quite at the best place we need to be. But Biden and his team are really wary of, I think, being perceived as weak on Iran, particularly in the aftermath of a missile attack launched by Iranian-backed militia group on a U.S. airbase in Iraq. So that's complicating the situation. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on that particular military strike on those Syria targets, because I think they should have been authorized by Congress, and they didn't get that authorization and only let Congress know 15 minutes before. So I have a major issue with that particular approach, but I'll save that for another day. But in this late hour, the Biden administration, I think, really must make good on its promise to get back into the Iran deal and offer a significant, good faith gesture of sanctions relief. If this Iran deal is going to be salvaged, and this could come in a variety of different ways, and this is some of the things we're having conversations with folks on the Hill about. One could be a new temporary general license to facilitate humanitarian trade related to COVID-19. It could, allow the flow of PPE, testing kits, respirators, sanitizer, and even the vaccine. So I think that could be one good faith step, because, the sanctions and the secondary sanctions are, while there are technical exemptions for some of these items that I mentioned, we're having the issue, or humanitarians and financiers are having the issue, that they're worried about getting hit with these additional sanctions. So even if there are technical exemptions in place, they're still too worried about getting hit with these penalties to have it be worth it. So Iranians are struggling, and right now, as a result, Iranian nurses are dying at higher rates than other healthcare professionals around the world because of it. It's really tragic. There's also the possibility to approve Iran's request for a $5 billion IMF loan. And I think this is a really good idea. This could, help, get them over the hurdle with the COVID-19 virus and the economic fallout as a result. So I think that's another idea. And some have floated the idea of unfreezing some capital in South Korea that Iran has that was, made from oil revenues that they don't have access to right now. There's other ideas as well. Those are just some of them. I mean, others are just like lifting it outright and trying to, have the oil, the oil revenues just keep flowing. But those are just some of the ideas that folks are talking about as good faith gestures. And for outgoing President Hassan Rouhani, and there's going to be an election in Iran in June that we're all watching really closely, for him to be able to re-engage on the Iran nuclear deal, he'd need sign-off from Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, to secure that, Rouhani probably would need a major U.S. concession. Now, I think just some key points that I wanted to flag before we sort of open up the discussion a bit are just some things that I really want to drive home. One is that immediate reentry to the Iran deal, I think, is overwhelmingly in America's interest. Reentry is the only path to immediately reimposing restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, and reversing some of the steps that Iran has taken since Trump's withdrawal. And, reentry also offers an immediate and significant de-escalation intentions we've seen since, for past several years, under Trump and even under Biden. So I think that's really critical. Also, the United States really has a narrow window to re-entry to the deal. Like I said, Iran's holding elections in the campaign starts in the spring, but in June they're going to have this new presidential election. Hassan Rouhani, who helped negotiate the original deal, can't rerun. So I'm worried that with this tight window to restore the deal before these elections, that hardliners, if we don't get back in the deal, could run on anti-U.S. rhetoric, anti-diplomacy rhetoric, and that's going to make it really difficult for the foreseeable future to get a new deal. So time is really of the essence. And Iran, I think I should also note, is that Iran has taken a lot of reversible steps so far. meaning that, a compliance for compliance return is really simple. It's really about getting the U.S. back in and getting Iran back in. Something I ask a lot of members of Congress is, well, what's the problem with going first? If we go first, we have snapback triggers that can be put in place, and we can put sanctions back on Iran if they're found to be cheating on the deal. And I usually get a lot of blank stares from members of Congress after I say that, but that's, or at least members of Congress who don't support the Iran deal. Anyway, delaying
Ahead.
return. Go ahead. Oh, so I thought someone was
You
supposed to
can
chime in.
with
Okay, I'll keep going. I'm almost done with my remarks here, and we can open it up. But so delaying return is a high risk, complicated strategy with little guaranteed benefit. I mean, there's really no evidence of the political will or capital in Iran to re-enter negotiations or to modify the agreement at this time. And I fear delaying risks no deal at all. And I think that's unacceptable considering how damaging it would be for Iran to possess a nuclear weapon. Granted, I should say that Iran has said that they don't have intentions to build a nuclear weapon, but just for them to get to enough nuclear material that they could build one, I think would be really problematic and set the whole region, really raise the tensions in the entire region. So I'll also say that refusing to live up to our commitments under the deal, I think, undermines U.S. credibility and leverage. If we're not looked at as a good faith negotiating partner, it's going to make it more difficult to solve issues like the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, or North Korea's nuclear program, or the war in Syria, or issues between Israel and Palestine. So I think that's really critical. And also, Iran has no current reason to trust our commitments and expanded negotiations if we continue to violate our commitments under this agreement already. So I think that's another key one. Just a couple more. Maximum pressure, I feel like, has been a maximum disaster and a maximum failure. And keeping it in place has some serious risks involved. And Iran now has more nuclear material, and they are continuing to develop low enriched uranium. So the only thing that we've seen to really address this is diplomacy. The war is not an option. Regime change, I think, would be an absolute disaster. So the way we're trying to frame it for people is we can take the diplomatic path by getting back into the deal, or we can just have more threats and more escalation. So just a couple points I wanted to leave you with. These are the main points that I try to leave with members of Congress and their staff, is that one, it's in the national security interests of the U.S. to restore the Iran deal and ensure all parties come to compliance. Two, is that restoring the JCPOA provides the soundest platform for further diplomacy to address the full range of issues that we want to, solve between the U.S. and Iran. Three, that the longer the period of non-compliance continues for the JCPOA, the harder it's going to be to impose any meaningful limits on Iran's nuclear program. And four, but last but not least, is that sanctions on Iran have really caused untold human suffering for millions of innocent civilians, and must be lifted on, to support diplomacy, but also just on moral and humanitarian grounds. If folks do want to get engaged, I think there is a good vehicle in the Senate. I know Senator Grassley, he recently became a co-sponsor of a repeal of the 2002 Iraq AUMF, the authorization for use of force that Trump used to assassinate Soleimani. So that was a really positive step by the senator. I think getting other members to support Senator Markey's Iran Diplomacy Act is a great ask for people that do want to participate in advocacy on the Hill to try to create the political space and pressure needed to get back into this deal in the short term, not the long term. So with that, I just really appreciate you all taking the time to hear me out on this, and I look forward to your questions.
Hassan, thank you. You packed a lot of information into that, and I'm sure we're going to get a lot of questions. Before we move to the Q&A, first, I'm going to just remind all of our listeners today and our participants if you want to go ahead and keep yourselves on mute, but or start your video feed up. So on your screen, if you find the start video, it's a little easier, I think, to engage in the Q&A when there are faces for people to look at. And Hassan, I'm sure would appreciate that. I know I do. And then what you'll do is you'll enter your question into the chat function. And so if you, usually that's on the right side of your screen, or wherever your buttons are, where you look at the reactions or participants, there should be a little chat with a little chat box. For me, that's in the middle bottom of my screen. For some people, it might be on the right-hand side. It can move around depending on what kind of device you're on. But if you want to enter your question into the chat, while we're waiting for a few of those questions, I just want to note that we have a nice lineup of programs at the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council for you, and you can find out what those programs are this spring online at www.icfrc.org. Of course, we continue to send you our notifications when a program is ready for registration. But if you want to look at that and get those kind of booked in advance, you're welcome to look online. We are very grateful to be able to make our online programs free and open to the public, but we rely on the support of our members and our attendees in order to operate. And many of you are members, and we thank you for that membership support. If you are not a member and you're just attending, or if you just want to help support the ICFRC, we always appreciate a free will donation that helps us cover our operating expenses. And you can find the link to donate in the chat section where you will be typing in your questions. So thank you in advance. Many of you have been longtime supporters, and we really appreciate that. We've been forced to change, as many others have in this era, and I think it'll make for a stronger ICFRC in the future. With that, I'd like to get to the questions because I see quite a few coming in. And Hassan, seldom do we hear of the Israeli nuclear program. Surely that's the elephant in the room. Would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's not just the Israeli nuclear program, but even the US's nuclear program. It's kind of, I think, ironic that the US is saying that other people can't have nuclear weapons when they have one of the largest nuclear weapon stockpiles on the planet. And also, the fact that Israel also has nuclear weapons, I think, is part of this conversation. So, yeah, I think that's a really important point. There are. Yeah, it's a major concern for the Middle East, and I think it puts us, it sets diplomacy back. I think it makes Iran, really nervous, to have someone that's, a supposed enemy there, having nuclear weapon stockpile. Now, it's also just part, that's one piece of it, but just the fact that, the U.S. and lawmakers in the U.S. have supported regime change and have called for that in Iran. It just really makes diplomacy just very difficult, and why I think, getting back to this Iran nuclear deal is so important, and trying to normalize our relationship with Iran in some way to de-escalate tensions and get us on a pathway to peace.
Great, thank you. Another questioner asks, Iran is active from Lebanon to Yemen. How does re-entering the JCPOA help blunt Iran's activities that don't involve development of nuclear weapons? Can you kind of clue us into some of the key elements of the JCPOA outside of the nuclear weapon piece?
Yeah, so as I kind of mentioned, I think I talked a little bit about this during my conversation earlier. Now, the JCPOA was never meant to be a silver bullet to address everything. No arms control agreement in history has ever solved every issue. So the way I see it is that we need to get back to the Iran deal as a baseline. We get back there, we have some good faith measures, lifting some sanctions, getting some curbing of the Iranian nuclear program, and building some of that good faith diplomacy, and then building on that to address these other issues that you speak of, from issues around proxies in Lebanon, in Yemen. Trying to resolve the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is a huge issue. Besides Iran, working on the ending U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition and ending the war in Yemen is a huge concern. And Javad Zarif did put out a 4-point peace plan for Yemen. So that's the kind of thing. Once we restore diplomacy on the nuclear accord, I think we can build on that to address the full range of issues of disagreement between the U.S. and Iran. But right now, with all these sanctions in place, that's impossible. I really think it's just so difficult because what other leverage do we have? And so that's why I'm again, trying to build momentum for diplomacy.
Great. You mentioned Chuck Grassley's co-sponsorship of the AUMF, ending the AUMF, and one of our questioners, first of all, I was going to ask because it's so rare that we get any really good news. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that. And one of our questioners also asked about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been an issue that Senator Kaine from Virginia has pushed for a long time. He's looked at as the war powers champ on the Hill. There are a lot of war powers champs, but he's one of the marquee war powers champs, and that's been a really core issue of his. And Senator Young, another Republican from Indiana, and so in 2002, the Congress, after the 2001 AUMF to go after terrorism, basically a blank check to do all these war on terror wars in like 40 countries and spanned over 20 years. They passed the 2002 Iraq AUMF to go after Saddam Hussein. Now, as anyone who knows anything about foreign policy or has been paying attention, Saddam Hussein ain't around anymore. And the Iraq War is over. There's a parliament there. It's just such an outdated, ridiculous AUMF to still have on the books. And after this strike on Syria, there's a lot of momentum to try to rein in the executive branch and trying to, curb their ability to launch these operations. Now, I will say that the president used Article 2 authority as like, okay, we're going to repel sudden attacks from Syria, and so the 2002 Iraq AUMF doesn't really address that. I would prefer they introduce a war powers resolution to basically cut off funds for any more hostilities in Syria. But still, nonetheless, this is a really important effort, and I was very excited to see that Senator Grassley added his name to the list of, I think it was 8 co-sponsors, 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats. I think it would be easily Googleable if folks want to check that out. But something that I think if folks here do have a relationship with that office and any staffers in that office, that's a really good way to start building some momentum towards other things that collectively we want to address. So be a good thank you for Senator Grassley's office. I hope that answers it.
Good. Thank you so much. Maybe I should have asked this first, but just to sort of step back just a little bit, for those who are on the call who may not be familiar with Friends Committee on National Legislation, could you just tell us a little bit more about FCNL and your mission?
Yeah, so FCNL is, I think, the oldest and largest Quaker lobby in the public interest on Capitol Hill. We've got about 60 employees. We've grown pretty significantly over the past few years, and the mission is to create peace on earth. We have a foreign policy program that where we're lobbying to end U.S. complicity in bad stuff like the war in Yemen, in good stuff like diplomacy with Iran, good stuff and bad stuff in our definition. and also working on ending devastation of climate change and trying to, and we have a whole domestic policy team as well that's focused on domestic issues. And it's governed by a Quaker policy committee. We have a Quaker CEO, Diane Randall, but the rest of the organization is not necessarily Quaker. I'm myself, I was raised Catholic. My dad's Muslim. I'm agnostic, and so you don't have to be religious, but it's a faith-based organization lobbying, on behalf of Quakers and the public interest.
Good, thank you. Here's a familiar attendee and questioner who would like to know, shouldn't we withdraw the US troops from Iraq? What is their role other than to entice attacks from militias?
I wish you were running our foreign policy. I think, it's a difficult one. We've been trying for a long time. I think, taking steps to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF, but also going after the 2001 AUMF is really critical for that. I think, if we want to zoom out for a second, not just talk about Iraq, but we have 800 bases all around the world, and a lot of them are in the Middle East. And for a long time, we've had this idea that we need to be, a hegemon over the Middle East and sort of dictate terms for, all these countries. We've done regime change wars. We've supported the coup in Iran in the 50s to overthrow Mossadegh, a democratically elected leader. We overthrew Saddam Hussein. We supported Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. So for decades, we've been trying to, lead the Middle East. Now, I think it's okay to support. I think humanitarian assistance is okay as long as it's, with no strings attached. But the idea that we need to lead and lead by force through military involvement, I think is really problematic. And we need a whole new approach and a new paradigm for the U.S. involvement in the Middle East, starting by bringing a lot of the troops home and ending this idea that we need to dominate this region of the world. And I think if we do, the actors on, the different states, Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, will be compelled and be forced to share the neighborhood and have to come to compromises if Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE and others know that they can't rely on the U.S. military as their security umbrella. So that's what we've been pushing for on the Hill.
Great. If you were to imagine the re-entry into the JCPOA was successfully negotiated and we reinstate diplomatic relations with Iran, and there's, a successful compliance effort, what do you see as the next set of diplomatic negotiations, or what's the path forward with Iran?
That's a great question. I mean, a lot of it really depends on the timing. If we are able to get back into the deal before this Iranian election, I think that question is, the answer is way different than if we try to do this after and there's a new government in place, or a new president in place, I should say. I would hope that the first thing we do is really, put pressure on Saudi Arabia and the Houthis and the Hadi government and the Southern Transitional Council in Yemen to fix and end the world's worst humanitarian crisis in the world. I'm hoping that comes even sooner, but my next thing on my agenda, if I was sitting in the Oval Office, would be to try to resolve the crisis in Yemen and use that good faith diplomacy with Iran to help, address that situation. And I think that would be really, I think that would be super helpful.
Good. One questioner would like to know or have you comment on Iran's use of ransom diplomacy, as in the recent case of Sagari Ratcliffe, a UK Iranian. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's not something I do a ton of work on, so I'm not going to claim that that this is my area of expertise. So I'll just couch my comments in that. There's probably others better suited to answer this question, but I think it's problematic. I think anytime you're using ransoms, it's not a good thing. But the issue is that if we've got these, crazy sanctions on Iran and we've just cut off, a diplomatic relationship with Iran, we just, I think it makes it harder to deal with these real issues. So um, I'm hoping that a return to diplomacy, a return to the Iran deal will have, knock-on effects like being able to address some of these hostage situations, releasing U.S. prisoners, that are stuck in Iran, and just, also, pushing Iran to have better human rights across the board. And, I don't think anyone's denying that there are issues, but the way forward is diplomacy, not war.
Great. You mentioned Russia's support for Assad, and one of our participants would like you to expand a little bit. What do you think the impact is related to the current state of U.S.-Russian relations and how that affects the Biden administration's approach and timing for reentry into the JCPOA, and how U.S. Members of Congress are viewing the Iran nuclear deal?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. As much as I can, I try to decouple, Iran from, our relationship with Russia or our relationship with China. But the truth is that there are things that are connections. Now, our approach and the maximum pressure approach. See what I did there? uh, Now, that pushed Iran closer to Russia. It pushed Iran closer to China, and they're now, depending on, China is working, with Iran and getting really cheap oil because Iran can't sell their oil on the open market, and so it actually, China's getting a really good deal on oil from Iran right now, and so again, it always goes back to, if we get, diplomacy flowing again, it'll, get Iran, not to be a little bit less close to countries like Russia and China and give us more leverage over humanitarian situations that we're trying to address. I think it'll help further isolate, Russia and their interests in the Middle East. So it can only be a good thing.
Good. Um, just to sort of go out a little bit further in just the climate of foreign policy in the Biden administration, this questioner would like to know, in contrast to domestic policy, Biden foreign policy appears to be unwilling to take bold actions such as lifting sanctions in tandem with Iran returning to compliance. East Asia policy, including North Korean nuclear weapons, appears to be unwilling to break stalemates. Is the questioner being too pessimistic in their assessment? What do you think the Biden administration foreign policy, Anthony Blinken, others in the administration, what do you think the future holds? Get out your crystal ball for us, Hassan, and tell us
Yeah.
what your thoughts are.
You know, I'm trying to be careful how I answer this question, but I gotta say I've been pretty disappointed so far. I'm not gonna lie. If I could just talk about Yemen because that's something I work a lot on. We've ended U.S. support for offensive operations supposedly. We've lifted this FTO designation on the Houthis, but they haven't said anything about the Saudi blockade on Yemen, which is cutting off the flow of food and fuel into the country and preventing people from being emergency evacuated out of Sana'a when they need assistance. And CNN just did this really blockbuster report on the Saudi blockade and how it's really exacerbating the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And right now, every 75 seconds, a kid is dying in Yemen, and there are 500,000 kids that are going to die this year if nothing changes. The strike on Syria, I think, was a disaster. It was done without congressional approval. And I'm sorry, but repealing the 2002 Iraq AUMF doesn't mean it's okay, that you just did this airstrike without support from Congress. The fact that we've kept in place all of these maximum pressure sanctions, I think are really problematic. Some may have been a little bit more, I was granted, I think it's a major improvement for me, in my opinion, to what we saw over the past, 4 years. So I don't want to be too hard, but I just thought they would be, being bolder in trying to do this foreign policy reset on a whole host of issues. So, and the Iran deal, I'm actually very concerned right now with the way they're approaching this. The Biden administration is, well, if Iran comes back into compliance, then we'll lift sanctions. Everybody that follows this closely knows that will never happen. That we need to make some good faith gestures for this to happen. And we left the deal first. I think that's a ridiculous idea that they're saying that Iran has to do all of the legwork to get back into compliance for us to even start talks. I'm hoping that in the coming weeks and months, I will be proven wrong, that this is just, they're so focused on, the relief bill that once they address this and maybe the infrastructure package and get the U.S. economy back on track, that we head in a better direction. But so far, I think here's the one thing I'll say that I'm optimistic about is that I think, unlike the Trump administration, people that love peace, like myself, and that want to see, us to actually lead on, a moral high ground and try to, restore diplomacy all over the world, is that they can be pushed. And I think with lots of engagement from us on our members and us writing op-eds, letters to the editor, doing coalition letters, and even the occasional rally in front of a congressional office too. I think they can be pushed, and that's where I'm putting my hope.
Good. Well, that seems like a very appropriate place to end today's program, with a ray of light. And I appreciate the great questions we got today. And Hassan, your comments and your work and your knowledge. I just want to say thank you to you for being here virtually with your Iowa City fans. We would normally be presenting in person to you a coveted ICFRC mug. You didn't even know you should be coveting this mug, but we will be sending it to you since we're presenting it to you virtually today, suitable for coffee, tea, or the beverage of your choice. And if
For
you're
me,
still
that would be
playing,
coffee.
I was going to say, if you're still playing music, outside of your work, you can, sip your beverage while you're playing guitar or drums or what have you. What instrument do you play?
I play guitar. I do a little flat picking, some bluegrass.
Awesome.
Rest in peace,
Well,
Tony Rice. I was really sad about that one. Major loss to our music world. But it keeps me sane here. It's a crazy place to be on Capitol Hill, and just really lean heavily on the music in times like these.
good. Well, we look forward to bringing you back to Iowa someday soon, and thank you so much. My thanks also goes to all of you, our viewing audience. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting us through these virtual times, and appreciate your engagement and always illuminating questions. So have a wonderful day, everybody, and we are adjourned. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Hassan. Bye-bye.